Sir Jamie, and I have been a knight now for, I think, 6 years, which means that I've been a knight longer than I've been a squire, though the longer than I was a squire, and I feel like I'm very much still learning. Um, for instance, over this quarantine, I just learned how to do a flat snap. But my initial martial training was all this kind of philosophical work that we're about to do. I was a fencer before I was an armored fighter. And one of the reasons I got into armored fighting was to better understand violence. I grew up very pacifist, was raised by a hippie. The only fist fight I've ever been in was with my brother. Um, and the idea of being struck and striking with intent was very uncomfortable for me. Um, and so this process that I'm going to talk about is something that I myself have gone through. Um, and in fact, still sometimes have to deal with. In my mundane life, I'm an occupational therapist and I work with kiddos with disabilities. So stepping onto a list field and throwing blows with martial intent is still not necessarily my natural go-to. That said, I think I've learned to overcome it, and I think that it's something that people can work on and get better at. So that said, let's just jump right in. I think that fighting at a competitive level is 80% mental. And some folks get that intuitively. I've met plenty of fighters who have never had to think about this a day in their life, and just have never run into any of the barriers that I see some of my students hitting, that I myself hit. But a lot of people do. And for a lot of us, the first fight that we have to win is the feeling that it's okay to be in a fight. And what I found is that there's really three main barriers that people come across, and they tend to come across them at different times in their journey. And they tend to have a harder time progressively getting over them. So if you may not have the sort of the novice block, but you might hit the one where you're an intermediate fighter, and that's harder to get over. And the one where you're an advanced fighter is even harder to get over than that. Okay, so the three main barriers to keep you from fighting well are fear of damage, conditioning against violence, and then being uncomfortable with domination. And we'll go into what I mean by all three of those in order. All right, so I think the first one is the most obvious, right? So people, especially people who haven't been in armor or who haven't been in armor very much, the first thing you got to get over is the fear of being hit and the fear of causing somebody else damage if you hit them. The solution to this is pretty simple and self-explanatory. It's that armor works, right? The one story that I like to relay is that I was talking to a young man about our martial sports, and he said, "Oh, yeah, that sounds really dangerous." He's like, "I was a rugby player for a while." It's like, "Well, I've heard horror stories about rugby players." It's like, "Oh, that wasn't very dangerous." And then he proceeded to tell me about the 3 operations he had to his clavicle, where they had to reattach his shoulder, where it was physically pulled from his sternum. I've had some small broken bones. I've had bruises. Some people have had serious injuries, but by and large, especially our tourney combat, exceedingly safe by contact sport standards. We don't keep track of injuries, but the most severe injuries that I've seen and know about personally were one, falling on the melee field, or long-term damage, some of it due to not being in good shape, some of it due to freak accidents that nobody could have stopped. And none of those were super serious. I think just being an active adult with an active hobby is dangerous. Ours, not much more so than any of the others out there. That doesn't stop some people from feeling like they're going to hurt their opponent. So one of the things that I like to think on is, if you've been doing this for more than a year, if you own your armor, you have made choices about what you feel is safe. Your opponent has decided to be in the armor they're in. Unless they're a completely new fighter, they have decided to take on whatever risks that they're taking on themselves, and likely have the skill set to back that up, right? Because if you go out there in minimums and you fight people who hit hard and you're not very good at blocking those people, you won't be fighting for very long, or you won't be in minimums for very long. So you have to kind of trust your opponent in that they are wearing what they feel safe in. Because we live, or we play in a society that is based around friendship and honor, you also don't have to trust them. You can ask specifically. If you're one of those people that is very worried about causing damage, not just pain, but damage, you can always ask somebody, do you feel comfortable in your armor? You know, if it seems glaringly unsafe to you, you can ask them how new they are. At the very extreme end of that, we have written into the rules that you never have to fight anybody that you don't want to fight. If you don't feel safe, if you're fighting somebody and you are very seriously worried that you're going to cause them permanent damage, you can yield any fight that you get into. It's not worth your mental health to feel pressured to fight in times that you're not comfortable. If you're concerned about your own health being hit in your own armor, that is something that you're going to have to work on, because there's always that line between, what do I have? Can I make it work? And we'll talk a little bit later about things you can do, drills you can do to feel safer in your own armor. But a lot of that is helmet time and fighting with people that you trust and keeping up that communication and saying, sometimes specifically, this is what I'm working on at a practice, saying, I don't feel safe getting hit. Could we work on that specifically? And we can talk some about what that looks like. Most fighters get over this, or they quit. I think a lot of people do quit because of this. But if you've been around for a little bit, if you get to the point where you're going to tourneys regularly, where you are starting to be competitive, or you're trying to be competitive, mostly that resolves on its own. What people bump up against that is a little bit harder to get over is that we are, as a society, conditioned against violence. And this, I see this coming out when people start traveling, when they start fighting people that they don't know, that they don't trust. And it really comes into stark contrast when you get people who are really good in practice, even against people who are unfamiliar to them. They go to tourneys and they don't perform where they feel like they should. And sometimes that is 100% mental. Sometimes that is, I don't know how this person will react if I hit them hard, whether in an armored spot or not. And I'm 100% convinced that that is conditioned into us. I find that a lot of my female students, especially my Southern female students, have that conditioned into them more than the male students. But it is across the board. I know I went through this. And that is a perception more so than it is a real risk. When I have folks that are really struggling with this, who've talked to people in their local practices who've been fighting for years, some of them, my first question is always, what's your reaction when you get a really strong, solid hit? Every time the reaction is, wow, that was awesome, thank you. And then I have to have them stop and think, okay, so if I do that to somebody else and I hit them really solid, let's say it was completely not blocked, hardest I could throw, solid thunk, why do you have to feel bad about that for doing it to me when you feel good about it when I do it to you? Right? That double standard doesn't make sense. And it's all about, you're perceiving an emotional component which isn't there. Right? So if you are worried, if you perceive that the person might be offended, they might be angry, they might be actually hurt, but you don't feel those things ever when you get hit, you got to kind of look at that double standard. Part of that is that you have to acknowledge that as much as people don't want to be hit, they are absolutely consenting to be hit by stepping into the list field. And you can kind of take away some of that emotional component when you realize that this is absolutely consensual act, and they are not going to be mad at you for doing what you came there to do and what they came there to do. Again, easier to say than it is to get over. But this one and the next one are very much about perception rather than reality. So most fighters that get to be competitive get over this to some degree or other. And this is another one where if you talk through it with somebody, if you work with a trainer, if you work on it explicitly, it can help a lot. But helmet time also helps this, right? So I've not met, like, for instance, an unbelted champion who's still worried about being conditioned against violence. You just can't reach that level or spend that much time in this sport without being somewhat desensitized to that. What some of those folks do hit, though, is that they are not comfortable when they start winning, which is an incredibly interesting phenomenon. And so the condition against violence, I ran up against some. I had an excellent teacher to get over that, Servitus, who is perhaps the most aggressive fighter that I've ever fought against, and a philosopher, warrior, poet. So it was perfect. Unfortunately, he retired about the time that I got good enough to worry about domination and the feeling of fighting somebody who is so far below my skill level that part of me perceived it as bullying. And what's interesting is that when I started teaching this class, it was very much about perpetrating aggression on others, right? That was what my struggle was. And I felt like I had an insight into how do you be aggressive when you're not naturally aggressive. What I found was a lot of people took the class because they were not as comfortable being aggressed upon. And so they hit this level, this barrier in the opposite way. I had a lot of students who would come up to me after the class or during the class and say, I really feel like so-and-so is a bully. And oftentimes they wouldn't use names. Or the hypothetical, what if you're fighting somebody and you feel like you're being bullied? And it's the flip of this coin, right? That when there's that power dynamic in such a physical way, there are very deep emotional issues that come with that on both sides. And this one is harder to tease out because this one is not just perception, but it's also how do we think about what we're doing. And I'll get more into that right now. The three people that I bring up for how this looks when you get over it are, and this is actually quite relevant, now King Felix, Servitus, who not many people now have seen fight, but also the fairly newly knighted Sir Sasha St. Martin. All three of those absolutely care if they injure people after the fight, and absolutely do not care or think about it during the fight. And part of that is mindset, and part of that is they trust their training, and part of that is experience and knowing this is how far I can push it before anybody's in danger. And a lot about it is how they think about what they're doing. All right, so I'm going to stop there before I go into our next thing. Does this resonate with anybody? Are there any questions so far? All right, I'm getting thumbs up. I'll take that. All right, so the big question then, especially for the higher end fighters that people are getting to be competitive, is what is it we're doing, right? Because how we think about what we're doing really impacts how we feel about what we're doing. All right. So at the lowest end of the spectrum, we could say SCA combat is a game, right? It's just fun. Shouldn't really worry about winning and losing. You're just there to have a good time. Um, and in that case, who cares if you're being aggressive enough? As long as you're enjoying yourself. Uh, if you're in that mindset, I don't know that I would even put in the emotional work to address that, right? Because um, you don't need to get better if you're just having fun. Um, if you want to be a little more competitive, if this is something that you are concerned with, the next level is we're doing a sport. And there's definitely some credence to that, right? We have rules that limit what we can do. This is certainly not a life and death situation. We have score points. I mean, it's very much a um, codified sport. Um, and it's nice to win in a sport, and there's a drive to win. Um, but in the sport context, it's not worth being uncomfortable to win. And I think this is where a lot of our upper level fighters or our top unbelts kind of get stuck. One way to get over that is to think about what you would want from your opponent, right? Just like when I talk to students about being hit, I talk about um, when you have somebody who gives you their all, how does that make you feel? And for most of them, having an opponent who is worthy, who's giving them a what would they would say an honest fight, is the core experience, right? That's what everybody's looking for. Even if they're outmatched, even if they end up getting hit, um, even if their opponent is aggressive, right? Um, and on the flip side, if you are the one, this is kind of where I got stuck. If you are the one who is winning fights and feel like you should maybe go easy on the ego of your competitor, um, the best advice that I got was it's always good to give a dragon to slay. Um, so my squire brother, Sir Ingram, uh, talked about how satisfying it was to finally win fights against some of the knights that he had idolized. And if from day one those knights had just let him win or had scaled back their own prowess, their own aggression, their own talents, then that wouldn't have been nearly as satisfying. You know, that part of the experience is knowing that there are people that are better than you, but that you're getting there, that you're chasing them. Um, and so even if you are in a position where it would take luck for your opponent to win, you're still not giving them something that they don't want by giving them that fight. Um, and this is going to be my mantra for the whole class. No double standards, right? Like if that's what you look up to, you can't turn around and say, but I can't give that to somebody else. That's just not fair. All right. So on the other end of the spectrum from the it's just a game and we're all having fun is fighting is serious, should be treated seriously, and is a martial art. And this is where this is the tradition I came from. It's that, yes, we are using batons. Yes, they are not swords. And our ancestors trained that way for real sword fighting. And that's the seriousness that we should take this with. That while this is not a life and death struggle, train as if we were going to be in one, and that this is preparation for that. There are advantages and disadvantages to that philosophy, but one of the advantages is that the seriousness that you bring to it alleviates some of these emotional concerns. Right? If you are training for a sword fight, an actual duel, whether or not your opponent cares that they are hit, has an emotional reaction to being hit, becomes much less important. right? That they are just an impediment to your advancement, which sounds cruel, but is not necessarily. And that's where that mindset comes in, right? Um, Now, I've found that since I've been knighted and since I can afford to be less competitive, I have been flipping back and forth. I kind of find myself somewhere between what we do as a sport and what we do as a martial art. Um, and it depends on which day you ask me which side of that line I think we fall on. Um, so your mileage may vary. All right, any questions before I move on to specific things you can do to train this? Good, good, good. Okay. Um, so I've heard a lot of really bad advice on how to be more aggressive, um, and I'll give you some just for comedic value, and to tell you what to watch out for, because some of these are effective, even if they aren't necessarily the right thing to do. All right. So one thing I hear often, and this is thrown out there in discussions more so than by trainers, but um, oftentimes I hear people talk about finding reasons that their opponent should be hit. And that is up to and including to change behavior. Actually, hear this from a lot of my brothers from around the society. Um, and we would just beat this or that behavior out of them. Thankfully, I don't hear it from mid-realm knights. And part of why I think that's not the way to go is, one, it adds in another emotional component, right? You were absolutely imposing your will on another person. And two, it doesn't work, right? Like, again, when I get hit hard, I think it's a great fight. If I'm trying to do that to change somebody's behavior or mindset, it wouldn't work for me. Why do I think it would work for them? Um, in a similar vein, people think about something that gets you angry or riled up, and then use that energy on the other person. Um, could be effective for some, but it seems to me that's not the safest place to come from. Uh, Partly because taking that extra emotional layer and adding it on top of seems counterproductive for me. If you're going to do that kind of emotional manipulation, why not do it right from the ground up? Um, Probably the scariest I ever heard was from a blog from an unbelted champion from another kingdom who said that they would they would have a child in their imagination scream as loud as they could to kick in fight or flight before melees, um, which for a lot of reasons sounds like a terrible, terrible idea. All right, so there's a way not to do it. Here are the ways I train folks. Um, and we'll kind of start easy and then we'll get more complicated. All right, so the first one is to not even think about aggression, because aggression is a loaded term. It's got a lot of emotional layers for folks. And I think that, again, changing how you see something can change a lot of the structures. So if you can fight from efficiency rather than aggression, you can get the same effect. So think about being so focused and so efficient that you're using less energy rather than more. And that's actually also a very good way to control a fight. And it's much better for you biomechanically to think about using less energy than it is to think about pouring your energy at somebody aggressively. Um, and that's something that you really have to train in person with somebody, the difference. Um, Another way to really, really get at this issue um, is to talk with fighters that you trust. And this is especially true in practices, uh, and particularly true if you're working on this explicitly. Um, So a lot of times I'll say, find somebody you trust, say, I'm working on aggression, and I want you to just defend. Or we're going to do 3 crown round passes where I'm going to fight you as intensely as possible, or you're going to fight me as intensely as possible, whatever it is. And so you set up that baseline there so they know that you're going to want to talk to them after. And then after, you talk to them. You ask questions like, how did that feel to you? Did you feel uncomfortable? Um, you made me uncomfortable, or I didn't feel uncomfortable when you did X, Y, and Z. Um, a lot of the hangups that I've heard people talk about, I don't think were ever real. So a lot of it is us projecting what we expect onto our opponents, which is not fair to them, not fair to us. Um, and this also lets us change. So it lets us request things, right? So if you're somebody who doesn't feel like they're comfortable going from 0 to 100, right? So maybe I say, you ask for 3 crown rounds from somebody you trust, and you immediately, oh, no, I could never do that. That's too much. Talking to your opponent lets you say things like, okay, so if we're going to talk about aggression, I'm training, scale of 1 to 10, 10 is a crown round, let's do 5, right? And you can ask um, for exactly what you want, and then you can talk about it later. Okay, so you feel like that was a 5, I felt like that was a 7. Why do you think that was different? Why do you feel like you were being less aggressive than I felt? If you have somebody you trust, that can be massively useful. Um, this also works if you are outgoing enough to do it with people you don't know. That one's a little harder, but um, if you feel like somebody felt bad after a fight, it is absolutely worth your time to talk to them. Uh, Again, that one's a little harder, especially if there's a power difference or social difference. I I'm fairly outgoing myself, and I'm not sure that I would have been able to or would have wanted to say walk up to a knight when I was a newer fighter and say, "Hey, you looked like you were upset on that last fight. Um, was it something I did? Was it something that happened?" Um, but again, start with people you know, start with people you trust, and then with that practice, you can get more comfortable with these conversations. Um, I can tell you that as a knight, I would be absolutely thrilled to talk to anybody, and would much, much rather have that conversation than have somebody leave the field thinking that I was angry with them or upset with them. Um, as I can't recall a time where that's happened where I didn't have a conversation with them right there. All right. The other easiest thing to do is to imitate the people that you admire. So I used Felix as one of my early examples. He is an excellent fighter to imitate. Um, and you can start to notice things. You can start to ask things of yourself and even him. Again, if you're comfortable enough to talk to him, he also likes to talk about fighting. Imagine that. Um, so things to think about: what's their demeanor? What do the fighters you admire, what do they look like walking onto the field? What's their presence when they're there, when they're fighting, after the fight? Um, if you have fought them, what's their energy like? When they're fighting you, is it overwhelming aggression? Is it um, bursts? Is it uh, does it feel like they're uh, paying attention to you specifically, or are they fighting their fight and not thinking about you other than just as an opponent as a set of moves? Whatever it is, there's all kinds of styles out there. And if you find one that calls to you, imitating that can be a way to kind of open windows into different ways of that thinking about fighting. And again, back to my refrain, no double standards, right? So if, let's say if you really admire Sir Felix's fighting, how do people feel about him off the list? He has no problem handing people losses in the list at all. And people don't think about him as far as I know, as callous or mean, or as a bully. So again, why would you be worried about that for your own image? And if you are worried about that, maybe compare what he does on the list and off the list and compare what you do. If it's drastically different, that's something to look at. If it's not, that's information for you. All right. The more advanced ways to do this involve a little bit more practice and a little bit more emotional work. So one of the ways that I got over the hump of being comfortable with violence was very artificial. So one of the things that I learned from actors, actually, and books on self-confidence in business, is that you can trick your body into feeling different ways pretty easily, actually. So one of the things that worked for me was controlling my breath. You can do breathing exercises to bring your heart rate up, to make your body ready for action. And a lot of that will affect your emotions and affect the way that you can process things. There's research out there that says your facial expressions actually impact your emotions. So that's why people say smile, even if you don't feel like you're happy, it'll make you happier. You can put on intense facial expressions, even if you are feeling self-conscious, not confident, and that can help kind of bring you to that emotional state that you need to be in to fight at your best. The top ranked fighters, I would say half or more, also have some kind of ritual that they do before they go into the ring. For me, for a while, it was doing a salute where I hit my shield. When I was coming up and starting to be competitive, I would hit my pauldron. And that for me was a reminder, this is what's going to happen to you if you're not paying attention, if you're not intense enough, if you're not in this fight. Some people jump. Some people, one of my squire brothers said that his ritual, putting his helmet on, put him in a different headspace. That once he was inside the helmet, he knew that he got to interact differently with people. Some sort of delineation between, this is normal me, this is fighting me, can be extremely, extremely helpful. And that is, again, somewhat artificial, right? Like, I'm not even talking about warm-ups. I'm not talking about getting your body ready. This is all about getting your mind ready and in the right place, which is equally helpful. My all-time favorite advice, though, is to treat your opponent as a legitimate threat, and to act like you are a legitimate threat to your opponent. I feel like no matter what level you feel like we're playing at, right? Is this a game? Is this a sport? Is this a martial art? That is the ultimate form of respect for me. Self-respect and respect for my opponent. For the higher end fighters, it's acknowledging that nobody can predict any one pass at arms. I could fight Branos 100 times, and he may win 99 of those bouts, but nobody can predict with 100% accuracy that he will win that 100th bout. And so that puts it on Branos to treat me as a threat for every one of those bouts. And it puts it on the newer fighter to not necessarily react emotionally when Branos treats them like a legitimate threat. For me, that is the ultimate in saying, I feel like you know what you're doing. I respect you enough as a combatant to give you my attention, to treat you as somebody that I need to pay attention to. Um, Again, if we're doing the martial art parts, it's I'm going to treat you like the warrior that you're trying to be. And then the last thing that I've got for the advanced techniques is kind of hit and miss. It's to fight for something. Um, Servetus talks about he was king's champion before he got knighted, and um, he'd been having some kind of plateau issues of his own, and he got called up in a champion's duel. Um, Came back and sat down, and his buddy was like, "You looked like somebody else out there," and he said, "I was king's champion," and that can take away a whole emotional layer, right? Um, we can use the Crown list as an example. Um, the one time that I fought in Crown, I wasn't there for me. I was there for my lady. My lady has expectations about my prowess that need to be met. My own concerns don't really factor into that. This is double-edged, though, because a lot of people have used this for some fairly bad behavior. Um, I've had a good friend of mine say that he'll never fight in Crown because if he decided that his lady needed to be queen, there are no rules that could stop him from making that happen. And so it's really taking your own ego and self out of the equation works if you have those same expectations of the thing that you're fighting for, right? If you really have to be cognizant of, if we're talking Crown, if I taint this victory, it looks poorly on my lady. Um, if I win at all costs, but it's seen as cheating, my kingdom looks bad because we're just thugs, and again, it doesn't mean as much. Um, so definitely finding that line where your honor or the honor of what you're fighting for is still paramount, but letting something greater than you fuel you to greater heights. All right, another quick break for questions, and then we can end with quick drills. Yeah, go ahead.
I just had a question. When you were speaking about working with somebody for the aggression levels, does it
Mhm.
matter what level they're at versus what you're at? Okay.
No, so what I find is it's often not necessarily the physicality of what's happening. So again, this is like once you've gotten past the I'm okay being hit, and I'm okay hitting somebody else. So the drills for that are very basic, right? Like if you're not comfortable in your armor, the remedy is being in armor and getting hit. If you're not comfortable hitting people in armor, the remedy is having other people in armor and hitting them. Um, if you're not comfortable being overwhelmed, being in situations where you feel like you're somewhat powerless because your opponent is so much better than you, it actually helps to have somebody who is better than you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It's one of the people that I trust the most is my husband because we both fight and we've
Mm-hmm.
both been fighting for the same amount of time. But
Mm-hmm.
he won't say this, but I'll say this. He is better than me.
Okay.
But I just wanted to know like what the level was at, if it needed to be a little bit higher, or would you suggest working with someone who is knighted versus not knighted? What the
So that's a good question. I am a very strong believer in a peerage is a reflection of experience, but that doesn't mean they're the only people to learn from. Um, Especially this kind of thing where it's more about your perceptions than it is about the other person. Trust is more important than skill. And in fact, some of the scariest fights I've been in are people who are untrained, because they're by far the most dangerous. And so that can be absolutely useful for figuring out what your emotional reactions are, and do they match up well with the emotional experience of your opponent. Anybody else before we move on to specific drills and then some discussion? No? All right. So fairly quickly, and we talked about some of these, some quick drills to go through, not quite level by level, because a lot of these will work on some of the foundational skills for all three barriers. But the first bit is, again, to explicitly say to your training partner, I'm working on aggression, and to talk about what you expect from them. Again, that predictability, the trust that they know what's going on, can all be very helpful. One thing that I find as a trainer is exceedingly helpful is knowing what to focus on while we're fighting so that I can give feedback later. One of the hardest things is to do 3 passes, have the person I'm fighting say, hey, what do you think about my footwork? Like, well, you were swinging at my head. That's what I was paying attention to. We'll have to do another fight, and then I can look at your feet. So if your training partner knows what to think about, what to watch, very helpful for them. All right. At the most basic, folks who don't feel comfortable getting hitting, like I said, it's really about being in armor. It's rare, but I've had a very new fighter who didn't even like the idea of hitting a helmet on a pel hard. Even that level of aggression was uncomfortable for her. And so really, at that point and even beyond, what you got to do is you got to get to where you're comfortable, right? So for that fighter, maybe it was she reaches out and makes a noise, right? For a more advanced fighter, maybe it's somebody standing there in armor, and I hit them in a spot that's very well armored, right? Maybe it's I hit them in their thigh and they're wearing full plate. And then you up it a little bit so you're uncomfortable, right? Part of my training regime for new fighters, especially fighters who are uncomfortable with it, is to stand very still, not defend, and let them hit me in a relatively unarmored spot, right? And then I react however I react. Maybe it was a really solid, hard hit. I'm like, oh, yep, that stings. But just letting them know, you're not going to hurt me. There's not going to be any damage done. Yeah, I got lots of bruises. I don't care about bruises. I will say, as a caveat, do not let people hit you in the head unimpeded hard. CTE is a very real thing, and be careful with your brain space. You only get one brain. Other things you can do is you can, again, kind of talk about aggression as a range, and you can say, okay, give me a fight at whatever number and talk about it afterwards. I am a huge fan of training crown rounds specifically for intensity, where at the end of it, you don't necessarily talk technique, and maybe you don't even talk who won or lost. You fight, somebody says good. If you're working on aggression intensity, you talk about that, but you don't talk about, well, you could have put your foot here. Oh, you just barely caught my guard here, because that's not what you're working on, right? Especially at the higher levels, there's a time for that, and there's time for working on whatever is really holding you back. Some ways you can do this if you don't want to do that kind of a high level fight is you can bend our rules a little bit. So I think one of the things that hinders some of this work is that we're essentially playing stick tag. And so our fights tend to be intense relaxed, intense, 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 relaxed, done. And since there's a very clear endpoint, and it's often not even during the most intense parts, it gets kind of hard to work on this, right, in sparring. But you can do kind of blows. So you can say, we're just going to go full bore till one of us gets hit 3 times. And that lets you stay in that intense headspace for, let's say, 3 minutes instead of the 80 seconds that our fights typically last. Similarly, if you also want to work on cardio, you can do timed bouts. These are far more exhausting than they would sound, and I definitely recommend starting at like 60 seconds, maybe 90 seconds, because you'll be surprised. Another thing you can do, especially for the conditioning against feeling aggressive, you can work on this completely artificially. When I was first working on this, I would be sitting at my desk at work, and I would work on emotionally manipulating myself to be angry at, intense at, aggressive towards inanimate objects. I'd sit there, I'd look across the room and be like, I really want to hit that rolling chair. And that rolling chair, if it comes over here, it's going to get it. And with practice, get to the point where I can provoke those emotional responses in myself without the layer of real animosity, right? Like, I'm not going to hit a rolling chair. The rolling chair never did anything to me. But it needs to be that artificial, because I also don't really want to hurt or hit my friends. I very much love most of the people that I'm fighting, and it needs to be artificial because, again, I'm a big softy in real life and would much rather hug them than hit them with a stick. But that's not what we're here to do, right? That's not what I'm here to do. That's not what they're here to do. And so it's got to come from some place that's not, I want to say not genuine, but that's, it's not organic. It doesn't have any of my ill will and ill feelings behind it. All right, that's all I got for practical advice. I would like to open this up to discussion. First thing, how do you all feel when you get hit with a really good, solid shot?
I have no problem with it. If I'm going to fight, I'd like to know that I actually got hit. The light brushes, it's like, well, typically my response is, that could have been a really good shot. I was open, you got it there, but you need to work on delivering and following through, actually delivering the power. So as somebody who throughout my SCA years has not been someone who hits hard most of the time, I understand when people don't take those. So I want to encourage them, if they're throwing at me, make sure it sticks solid.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something I've been working on for myself for years to make sure I can hit solid.
Sure.
So I certainly don't have a problem getting hit, as long as it doesn't like super hurt. There are those shots that rattle you, of course.
Sure. So, and that actually brings up a good point. How do you feel about the shots that rattle you? How do you feel about the shots that maybe are too hard?
For me, if it just happened, no big deal. I might mention, hey, that was a little excessive. It happens. It's a contact sport. If I notice it's a pattern with somebody, I'm definitely going to have a discussion. Because if it's a pattern, look, you don't have to hit that hard. One of my Squire brothers years ago had just spent several years away from the SCA as a semi-pro football player playing lineman, and had a bit of a violent streak to begin with. When he came back, he was doing blacksmithing for a living and picked up a 1.5 hand sword. And he hit me in the same spot a couple of times, like to broke my collarbone. And I got really angry at him and had to stop midway through my anger and realize he didn't actually power up. His body mechanics had just gotten so good that with his mass combined with his body mechanics, while he knew he was hitting hard, he didn't realize just how much the force was transferring.
Mhm.
So then we had to have a different discussion, one, about my anger issues at the time, and two, about him recognizing the level of power he was generating beyond what he used to be able to before he had gone and done something else and learned to use his body. So it was a learning experience for both of us.
Yeah, and I think that's really astute. So what you did there was a lot of what we're talking about, right? So you had an emotional reaction, and then you examined it and realized that that layer was about you projecting something onto him that wasn't really happening.
Right.
Yeah.
That and the fact that it really, really hurt. Got a 350-pound lineman hitting you with a hand and a half in the collarbone repeatedly. It kind of hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. So how many then here feel roughly like that? That, you know, a good solid shot, even one that's painful, is either what I'm looking for or it was just an accident. And then counterpose that with how many people here feel bad when they hit solidly or what they perceive to be too hard.
So I'm perfectly, like Tana said, I'm perfectly fine with getting hit. Like he said, if it's excessive, I usually will let them know, have a conversation. That was a little excessive.
Mhm.
I have actually apologized for hitting people hard.
Mhm.
I was at a TOC and somehow got a flat snap through a knight's, defense, and was like, "I'm so sorry," because I hit him in the head. And he goes, "No, don't apologize to me." I'm like, "Oh, okay, never mind." Like it was conscious to immediately go, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Like,
It's ingrained.
yeah, so that's my issue. Yeah, when I hit someone and he was like, "Yeah, it was good. It was hard and not like too hard. It was a good telling blow." But I was like, "No." Like, so I immediately was like, "I'm sorry," and he's like, "Don't apologize." I'm like, "Okay."
So you might be a good one for the practice of just stand there and hit somebody who's not defending themselves. Yeah, again, you don't have to blast them. Just get used to, I am making a loud noise on somebody's helmet. I'm hitting with power on armor. Get used to that, like they're not getting upset, they're not damaged, they're not hurt.
And it's interesting because that's really only my mindset in tournament. If I'm on a melee field,
Sure.
there is
Yeah,
no
that's a whole
worry.
different
It's just a
kettle of
whole
fish.
different thing.
I'm a tourney knight. I'm not a melee knight, so you'd have to talk to somebody else about that anyway.
I do have a question regarding introducing intentional aggression into the fight. What I have found is far too often when I choose to try and flip a switch and become really aggressive, I end up trying to almost over aggress and just almost beat somebody by throwing so many things so quickly, so aggressively that something's going to come through. And
Yep.
I feel like I lose some of that cerebral connection and the ability to observe what's going on and adapt and adjust. So rather than fighting to my opponent, seeing where their openings are, seeing what they're telegraphing and responding, I'm just trying to overpower them with BS and hopefully something slips in. That's not the fight I want to give.
There is a place to learning that kind of aggression. Um, and I use the term because of its emotional layer, right? It's a loaded term. What I strive for when I'm fighting is not necessarily aggression, it's intensity. And that intensity can go both ways, right? Um, I'm a Musashi fan. Musashi says always be cutting. And I take that to mean this fight can be won at any moment. I need to be 100% present at any time because the step that I take this way could win me the fight. The step that they take that way could lose them the fight. Um, and having that intention and intensity with every action is where I aim to be. So that's what I mean, and that's what I teach when I teach aggression. Um, although that's not exactly interchangeable. But I think you'll notice, again, if you look at the top fighters in the world, um, nobody would say that they lack aggression, but they're not doing what you're talking about. They're not necessarily throwing flurries of blows, but they are watching all the time for that millisecond, for that 2 degrees, for whatever advantage they can take in every moment.
And I think that's one of the challenges that I found is I don't want to be the violent, aggressive fighter. I want to have that intensity. I want to be able to come in and throw a series of shots while holding on to the mushin no mushin or any other variant thereof. How am I observing and responding to my opponent as opposed to I'm so in my own head that I'm not even really seeing what my opponent's setting me up for. And I think that's a lot of times when I'm fighting the more senior fighters, when they make the comments of, hey, I had to pull out the knight stuff to get through that. That's great. How do I do that? How do I take that step to see what they're seeing, as opposed to I brought myself to this level and I can't seem to push past that.
Sure. Some of that is beyond this class.
Fair.
And we've talked some about that. Some of that is, do you have the tools in your toolbox? How much of your fighting is automatic? How much do you have to think about? The knights, the royal peers, all have a different level of unconscious ability. So, for instance, I don't think about my defense. I was gonna say I don't fall for many fakes. There are some people who can fake me, but most fighters find that I am fairly implacable because I'm not paying attention to them. My brain knows how to defend, so I get to think about other things. The top level fighters almost don't think about fighting. So I heard a story about Branos, who was at Candlemas one year, won the fight that he was in, walked over to the list next to him and said, "Hey, 3 blows ago, you should have done this," because he almost wasn't paying attention to what was happening where he was. He was paying attention to other things. So when you get to that level, you can start paying attention to other things, paying attention to intensity, paying attention to your opponent rather than where do I put my feet? What do I do with my hands? What's the timing on this shot? So some of that is just helmet time. All right, so we're running a little low on time, so I'm gonna jump to the end here. And has anybody felt like they've been bullied on the lists?
I feel like I was, but it was a long time ago,
Mhm.
and it wasn't in this kingdom.
That's fair. And if you feel comfortable sharing the particulars, just because it can be useful for the class.
Sure. When my husband and I started training, we were training with an individual that they like to hit you where there was no armor and not lightly. And their method of that was if I hit you there hard enough and long enough, you'll learn that armor needs to go there. And this was like years 1 through 3 of us being in the SCA. So it was right in the beginning. So we really didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about or money because we were in college to get the armor necessary. I mean, we had armor and we were protected, but it was still, you had to find it mostly in the loaner gear and kind of fix it to where it needed to be. But it was mostly that. And there was some issues with me being female as well, but that's a whole nother conversation.
I had kind of expected that was part of it. It's much less common now. And in fact, I've been in the society now for, oh Lord, a number of years. And I haven't experienced it, but I hear there was a very real, we will keep females from being fighters because it's not their place. Society-wide, I thankfully have not seen that personally.
And it is much better here than where I was. So.
Oh, good.
And where I was has also gotten better. So.
So yeah, that's a pretty good example because it sounds like there was not necessarily a personal emotional component, right? Like the person you were fighting wasn't like, I want you to suffer. But there was also clearly an unhealthy aspect to that interaction. I wonder if I'm sure some of this is hindsight, right? Figuring out their motivations and what was happening. But I wonder if you had had a conversation with them and said, I know that that spot's unarmored. I will eventually get armor that goes there, but I can't afford it right now. I wonder if that would have changed that dynamic any.
We did have that conversation. It didn't really stop.
Oh, well, so my other bit of advice for those situations is you
Unfortunately.
never have to fight them.
Yeah, that was the other thing. He was the only person showing up to our college practice.
Okay.
It was I know, it was just a whole bad funnel of not great. But like we eventually graduated from college and went somewhere else. So it was totally fine. And we both didn't, and my husband and I obviously have both not quit fighting. So
Sure, which is good to hear. All right, I got a chat message real quick. Let's see. So Kathleen says, thank you for this discussion. I am not a fighter, rather an equestrian. A lot of what I do with my horse is very competitive, and we do it at the national level. It has been hard at times to bring down that competitiveness. This has been very helpful. Thank you. And that is something to point out, though, that again, this is kind of the introductory class to it. I've done more advanced classes about getting into this mindset. And once you learn how to do it, it's also very important to learn how to turn it off, which can be a whole different skill set. All right, I think that we are beyond time. If anybody else has any questions or comments, I can take them now. All right, thank you all so much for your time. I enjoyed it.